Hi, everyone joining us. We'll just give it a minute or so, let people trickle in here. Okay, we'll get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Invasive Species Center's webinar series. My name is Madison Sturba, and I'm a Program Development Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, where we'll get to learn about managing invasive species in an urban environment. Before we begin, I just wanted to note that the Invasive Species Center acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robertson-Huron Treaty area. We are meeting virtually, so I would like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the lands and waters where each of us attends this morning's meeting. Just in case you didn't know, the Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization based in Sault Ste. Marie. We connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We've got lots of free resources on our website that it can include invasive species profiles, best management practices, and recorded webinars like the one we're doing today. You can also sign up on our homepage for our newsletter, biweekly media scan, Oak Wilt Wire, and event invitations, which is where you can hear about upcoming webinars. The last thing I wanted to quickly mention is that our invasive species training program offers virtual self-paced courses for anyone wanting to learn more about the impacts of invasive species in their community or workplace. We currently have 3 courses available with our training program. We do have more currently in development, so please sign up to receive updates on when those courses will become available. Just a couple really quick housekeeping notes before we get started here. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so if you have questions at any time, please just type them in the Q&A box and I'll read them out loud to our speaker at the very end. If you're having technical difficulties at any time, please type them in the chat box or respond to the email found in your registration and we will get them resolved for you. We've also enabled closed captioning, so if you'd like to follow along that way, you can turn them on with the closed caption button on your taskbar. Lastly, there will be a very brief survey following the webinar, so if you could take some time to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. It just helps us shape our topics for future webinars. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our wonderful speaker, Allie. Allie Abram is an invasive species coordinator at the City of Mississauga and is responsible for implementing the city's invasive species management plan and implementation strategy. Allie specializes in invasive species management, ecological restoration, and ecological monitoring. She's been working at the City of Mississauga for nearly 5 years to reduce the abundance of invasive plant and pest species and maintain or restore healthy ecosystems in Mississauga's natural areas. So thank you so much for being here, Allie. I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'll just take a moment to share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, can you see my presentation okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Amazing, thanks so much. So thanks again for having me and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really happy to be here talking about the work that we're doing in Mississauga and about all of the learnings that we've come by through creating and implementing our invasive species management plan and implementation strategy. So I wanted to start off just by setting the stage just before we jump into some of the details of how we created the plan and how we're using the plan by going over some of the unique features of Mississauga. So first of all, Mississauga is really big. It's really large in size. It's actually the 6th largest city in Canada, and it has over 780,000 residents living here, and many people also commute here to work and use the natural spaces and parks as well. Our natural areas cover about 7.5% of Mississauga, and we have approximately 2.1 million trees, which equals about 20% canopy cover. it's important to put the size of the city and the specific considerations of Mississauga into context before we start making the plan and before we start talking about the plan, because although with invasive species management, we all face similar challenges, each city or landowner, I should say, faces unique challenges as well. And one of the ones that we have in Mississauga is that Mississauga is very, very big, and we have a lot of people here. One thing I haven't covered is that the dominant tree species in Mississauga, at least 15 years ago were sugar maples and ash trees. However, with the arrival of the emerald ash borer, which many of you may know is an invasive insect that ultimately leads to the death of ash trees, we've lost about 10% of our canopy. Now, a lot of that is regenerated, and we have programs that we work on to regenerate that canopy. But it is a really good example of how one invasive species can come in and make a really big impact in an urban forest environment, or any forested environment for that matter. All right, so obviously, to start off making a strategy and a plan, we need to have the backing to do that. So we have a couple of plans and strategies that supported the creation of the Invasive Species Management Plan. One is our natural heritage and urban forest strategy. So this guides high-level strategy for the natural heritage system and urban forest management. And it lists invasive species as one of the main strategies in the document. And it also specifically talks about creating and implementing a pest management plan for the urban forest so that we can build on the lessons we learned from dealing with emerald ash borer. We need to be ready to respond operationally to these threats, and also make sure that when we're planning our restoration programs, and when we're planting trees in the forest, or in the urban forest, and in our natural areas, we're doing so in a way that makes the natural systems more resilient. So for example, by making sure that we're maintaining biodiversity in our natural areas and in our tree canopy, we can decrease the impacts of future threats that are species specific, like emerald ash borer, which specifically targeted ash trees. So we want to make sure we have a strong diversity in our canopy so that we can avoid threats like that in the future. The second is the urban forest management plan. So this plan was produced in tandem with the natural heritage urban forest strategy, and it outlines specific actions to be taken to implement the broader strategies related to the urban forest and natural heritage systems. And it also calls for plans for invasive plant and invasive pest management. So those are the two documents that really backed the creation of the Invasive Species Management Plan. In addition to the strategy documents supporting the creation of the plan, the city also has a large database of natural heritage data that has been collected. Well, now it's been almost 30 years, but at the time of the creation of the plan, about 20 years of data that we were able to use to put into the planning of our invasive species management plan and implementation strategy, which I'm just going to call the IS&P from now on to save some words and some time. So these natural area surveys provided important background information that I'll talk about a little bit when in the next couple of slides, when we were determining how to prioritize different management areas and also different species to include in the plan. So we were lucky to have this data. And that brings me to our background analysis report. So the first step in creating the plan was hiring a consultant to conduct this background analysis report. This report provides a comprehensive background and a comprehensive background on all of the different documents that were existing at the time, both internal to the city and also external documents. So those could be documents that outlined how to manage invasive species, how to identify priority species and priority sites, and also how to analyze existing conditions. So there was a thorough document review, and then there was also consultation with other agencies that work in the restoration and invasive species management field. So those were our neighboring municipalities, conservation authorities, and other organizations that specialize in invasive species management, so that we could get all of the information possible to guide the creation of the plan. All of the city's strategic documents were also reviewed for guiding principles, which allowed us to create a vision. And then we also incorporated the identification of priority species and sites into this background analysis plan, which we'll cover in the next slides. I will just note the background analysis report is available online, so you can go and check that out anytime if you want to learn more. Okay, so setting priorities. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, in invasive species management is deciding where to start. So one of the components of the background analysis report, as I mentioned, was narrowing down which sites we were going to be working at. And basically what it came down to is we had a list of conditions that we looked over that I have listed on the screen here. But what we wanted to do is narrow it down to the sites where the work was going to be the most successful. So basically these ended up being the sites that were in the best condition, and we felt we could have the most impact with the limited resources that we have. So you've heard the expression low-hanging fruit. That is what we were looking for. We were looking at opportunities to make big impacts in high-quality areas so that we could keep our high-quality natural areas very healthy. We also typically went for larger areas, larger natural areas that contained high-quality pockets, so that we could increase the amount of land that we were covering. So if any of you are familiar with early detection, rapid response, or the principles of managing invasive species while they're still small or in isolated pockets, that's really what we were going for, is looking to identify areas where we could manage these invasive species before they got out of hand. And that's why we were looking for areas that didn't have as many to start. Okay. And yeah, the last thing I'll say is the reason for this is we wanted to make sure that we were setting goals that were achievable, so that we could get the best long-term effects, long-term results for our efforts. This is the list here of our priority sites and also our demonstration sites. So all of the priority sites are represented on the map with little red dots, and you can see that they're also, we also try to distribute them across the city as much as possible. There are some areas, unfortunately, that don't have as much natural space, so it was harder to find priority sites within those areas or those wards, which are the numbers that are on the screen. So we have 10 priority sites, and in addition to those priority sites, we also have 2 demonstration sites. Now, these demonstration sites are really, they're really meant to showcase the work that we're doing, as well as allow us to use information learned from managing these sites to apply to managing the priority sites once we get to those sites. So right now we're working primarily in the 2 demonstration sites. We'll be working on them for approximately 5 years. And then we'll take all of the lessons learned from working in those sites and apply them to our future projects. The demonstration sites were also chosen based on the different challenges and opportunities that they presented. So we'll go into more detail about them a little bit later, but they are quite different sites, and that will allow us to learn more through our trial period, basically, and also learn more about the costs of different types of management. Okay, so next up we have species. This one might have been even harder than the sites because there are so many invasive species that we could choose to be on our list. And once again, I have the criteria and the documents that were reviewed when the species were prioritized. However, what we basically had to do was choose the species that that were felt to have the greatest potential impact on the ecological communities contained within Mississauga, or those that had impacts to human health. So when you're looking at invasive species management, you really need to have priority species because those will help you identify which areas you're going to work on first. So having that list of priority species really drives forward where the management happens. And I have a list on the next slide of our priority species. So you can see here that we were able to narrow it down to approximately 30 priority plant species and 3 priority pest species. Now, like I was saying before, this isn't to say that we wouldn't ever manage species that are outside of this list, but these are the species that we prioritize and that drive our management plans. If we were working in an area, for example, and another invasive species was present, it was in one of our priority management zones, then we would consider managing it as well if we felt that it would have a benefit. It would for sure have a benefit, but if we felt like leaving it would compromise the health of the ecological community that we were working in. So I wanted to just take a quick moment to touch base on some of the lessons learned when we were creating the plan, and then we'll talk a little bit about the plan itself. So background studies are essential for setting priorities. The background analysis report proved to be even more useful than I think was anticipated, particularly in consulting with other agencies that do similar work in the field. So collaboration is something that we definitely are continuing forward into implementing our plan. It's really helpful to have this identified in a higher level strategic plan or master plan. That is the mechanism that allowed us to put the resources into creating the plan. So if you're looking to create a plan, that is something that was definitely very helpful for us that I would suggest if possible. And then finally, incorporating decision-making tools into the application of the ISMP in the long term. This is actually one for the ISMP itself, which we'll talk more about, but learning about those decision-making tools that others have used, what has worked, what hasn't worked, is something that was also analyzed in the background analysis report and was really essential for creating the ISMP. Okay, so with the info that was collected in the background analysis report, our invasive species management plan and implementation strategy was created. And this plan really provides a strategic and phased citywide approach to managing Mississauga's invasive species. And it also guides our actions, responses, decisions, and decisions about invasive species on a day-to-day basis. It's really important for us to have clear priorities and decision-making tools so that we can justify all of the work that we're doing. We are, a governmental organization, which means that all of our work is very public. So it's really important to be able to refer back to this plan and have a strong structure for the work that we're doing and strong justification for the work that we're doing. The last thing I'll mention before we move on is that this plan is, of course, meant to be adaptive. We have plans to update it approximately every 5 years, but really it's going to be on an as-need basis so that we can incorporate all the learnings that we've had while implementing the plan, as well as any additional knowledge or best practices that may have come out through our partners, the scientific community as a whole. So we want to make sure we're continually updating our processes so that they're working the best for us. So with every good plan comes some goals and objectives. So the goal of the ISMP is to provide an organized, targeted approach to managing terrestrial invasive species in an economically efficient manner, while also enhancing native biodiversity and overall integrity of the city's natural areas. We've refined that a little bit more down in our objectives, basically aiming to reduce the relative amount of invasive species and increase ecological integrity. We also want to make sure through the plan that we're optimizing the limited resources that we do have through collaboration with partners and the public. This is a collaboration opportunity. It's an opportunity to raise awareness and inform more people about what we're doing. We really need the cooperation of the community at large in order to get all of this work done. We certainly can't do it alone. So thanks for having me again. And then, of course, as I was mentioning, we want to make sure that we're keeping track of everything that we're doing and monitoring the effectiveness of the ISMP so that we can inform adaptive management and keep improving our processes as we move forward. So in order to achieve our objectives, specific targets were also created within the plan. So what is shown here is just the management targets. So like the invasive species management targets, there are other targets in the plan, but we don't have time to go over all of them today. So I thought we would start by talking about these. So really, and these ones match up with the objective to reduce the relative abundance of invasive species in Mississauga. So this really acts as a guide for planning the management work at our invasive species management plan priority sites, and it also offers achievable targets for project completion. So you can see the objectives on the left. You can see the actions here. So the first action, it's probably quite small on your screen, but it says implement management in our 2 demonstration sites. And then it has specific targets for those sites as well as a timeline. As I mentioned, we're hoping to follow this approximately every 5-year schedule. So working at each set of sites for approximately 5 years. But there's also this caveat here, or until the target has been achieved. So depending on how it's going at that site, in some cases, I anticipate that we'll be able to finish the significant control work and restoration work in advance of the 5 years, but in some cases the site might not be set up or might not have the features that allow for that to be the case. So we are adapting it based on what we're finding at each site, and we'll talk about that more when I show some images of the demonstration sites. For invasive pests, which is the line at the bottom here, we're really looking to stay within the thresholds that are identified and established by integrated pest management. So that's going to look different for every pest. In some cases, we're looking to completely eradicate the pests. So Asian longhorn beetle, if you have heard of that, that pest was something that Mississauga dealt with or in the early 2000s, and it was actually declared eradicated here, which is really important because it is more of a generalist species, in terms of what types of trees it likes to attack, and that could be, and it does like sugar maples, which are a huge part of our canopy in Mississauga. So it was really important that one was eradicated, and it was also possible. So there were also the management tools known and created to allow us to eradicate that pest. Some of you may have heard of spongy moth. It used to be called gypsy moth. So that is a pest that has been around for over 100 years and even more in Mississauga. And it's not one that's ever going away. So for that one, we're really looking to control the population to a level that doesn't impact or doesn't have significant impacts on our tree canopy. So we want to make sure that the levels are low enough that we're not seeing a lot of tree mortality across the city. So we set those priorities based on the individual pest. Okay, so I really wish I could go through all of ISMP components in detail because there's a lot of really helpful tools within it, but today I'll just highlight a couple of the components of the plan. So what is really helpful is that it provides specific instructions on how to collect baseline inventories. It provides tools for determining when to control species, when to monitor species, and when to conduct follow-up restoration work, or when to leave the site to naturally regenerate. So after you conduct invasive species control, sometimes depending on what the invasive species is and what the conditions of the site are, sometimes the native vegetation will grow back naturally, but sometimes you have to go in there and do some restoration practices, which may involve restoration plantings, fixing the soil, installing a cover crop. And this plan really laid within the invasive species management plan. There are decision-making tools that really outline how to make decisions about each situation that you're in. So you can actually see on the right-hand side here, I have this image of one of our decision-making tools. There's a big chart with management triggers that goes along with this tool. But basically what it is showing is that depending on what management triggers or what triggers exist, you may move from a baseline inventory where you're just identifying what invasive species are there to either controlling the population or maybe you're not going to continue to monitor the population. So some of the triggers for control might be what are the characteristics of the site? Is it a high quality area? Is it a sensitive ecosystem? Are there species at risk that exist there? So all of those would be triggers under number 1, you can see, and if any of those existed, then we would move into control. If none of those existed, and there are more triggers, I just named a few, but if none of those existed, we might continue to monitor the site to see what shows up or if anything changes that would make us move into the control phase. Okay. So I think it's important when you're working on a plan to note how far you've come. So we've now been using the plan for about 3 years, and we've been able to grow the invasive species management program at Mississauga over that time. So the draft of the plan was originally made in about 2017, but it was revised. It went through a couple of revisions and is now publicly available on our website. So it was published there in 2021 with some of the new information that we'd gathered since the initial plan was drafted. We were also able to secure funding for work at our demonstration sites a couple years ago through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program funding source. And this was really important, one, because it helped us kickstart more significant control efforts at our demonstration sites. And 2, because it helped justify the creation of the Invasive Species Coordinator role. So previous to 2022, the coordinator role didn't exist. There was a technician on our team who was dedicated to invasive species management, but there was no coordinator, so it was difficult to really push forward implementation of the plan. So we were able to gain an extra staff member, and that's the role that I'm in now. Capital budget has been secured, so this is really important because now we're able to plan the work at our demonstration sites and at our priority sites and procure contractors to do the work as well. So really we've been working on building our operational capacity to get this work done. We have also completed baseline monitoring at all of the priority and demonstration sites, which is a really important component of the invasive species management plan in order to know what you need to control. You need to get out there on site and map it all out. And this informs costing. It informs decisions in terms of who is going to do the work. So is the work most appropriate for volunteers, for staff, or for contractors? We don't do any in-house chemical control, so we have to contract all of that work out. So the baseline monitoring provided us with really good background information that we can use to project costs and create site-specific management plans. Oops, sorry, let me just get back here. We also have been running a successful integrated pest management program for spongy moth, which has really developed over the last couple of years. I talked a bit about that and how really the goal is to keep the populations under control. Some of you might be familiar with this pest because it has been quite present over the last couple of years, or maybe not this year and the year before, but previous to that. So we've been able to establish an ongoing program and secure budget for continued management of that pest as well, which is really important. And we've also been able to do more than 3 years of invasive species management at demonstration sites. So things are moving along. So you might be wondering how the plan is translating into our current operations. Current focus of the plan is creating site-specific plans for our priority sites that will be expanding our work to over the next several years. So we're coming up on about the 3 or 4 year mark for our demonstration sites, depending on which site, which means that we're going to start looking into how we can start managing at additional sites. So we'll be working on creating those plans and doing some more site-specific mapping this winter. I mentioned procuring contractor services for 2024 onwards to support our invasive species management plan work. We'll be continuing to work at the demonstration sites. We'll be mapping our big 6 species citywide, which I'll talk a bit more about. And we're also working on the expansion of our volunteer program, which I will talk about in a couple of slides. And finally, we are also working on increasing our early detection rapid response, sorry for the acronym there, monitoring for invasive pests and diseases. So this is a brief overview, but I will go into a couple of these in more detail right now. Okay, so I've mentioned our demonstration sites a couple times, which are the sites that we're actively working in and trialing the tools and methods that are outlined in our invasive species management plan. So what you can see on the screen here is an aerial image of Credit View wetland, which is actually a significant wetland, and it's completely fenced in, so it's not publicly accessible. On the screen, you can see some different polygons in different colors, which both represent management zones and also represent the phases of work at this site. So the management zones we created to delineate the work areas and track project costs. We were finding it was a lot easier to track the work that we're doing. So control tracking is a really important part of planning. And also of planning work and also planning, monitoring, and maintenance work. So we found that it was easier to do that with these management zones. And they also really help delineate the work that we're doing. So when we're working with contractors or staff or volunteers, it's a lot easier if we can show them exactly where the work is supposed to start and end. So a couple of the things that we have learned from working in this site are this site is primarily, the site is best for work with staff and contractors. It is not a very volunteer-friendly site. At the very sort of north west end of the site, where you can see the rectangular polygon there, there is an area there that volunteers did help work in, but typically this site has been mostly worked on by staff and volunteers. And that's an important it's important for us to know because it basically means that it's going to be more expensive, and that sites of a similar nature will typically be more costly than those sites that are more volunteer friendly, which we did anticipate, but this is a good example of that situation. We also learned from this wetland that in some cases 5 years of management is not going to be enough. Once again, we knew that going in, it was going to depend on the complexity of the site, but this site is a really good example of that. And the reasons for that are that it is a sensitive wetland. It does contain known species at risk. So we wanted to make sure that all the work that we were doing was taking into consideration all of those ecological features and all of those sensitivities of the site. This site was basically completely surrounded in a wall of an invasive species called European buckthorn. And what that really means for control is that if we were to take all of that buckthorn away at the same time, buckthorn is an invasive woody shrub, in case I didn't say that. So it makes quite a thick border. And if we were to take it away all at the same time, we would really leave the wetland exposed to all of the elements, and this could negatively impact, would negatively impact the health of the wetland. So what we've decided to do is take a phased approach, and the colors on the screen here represent the different phases. Currently, we're in the teal colored phase, so the phase that's at the more northwest side of the wetland. And so we're taking this phased approach and working on approximately 1/3 of the wetland at a time. And we're working primarily in the upland area that surrounds the wetland. And that will allow the invasive species removal to be done in that area. Then we can work on restoring that area with native vegetation. Once that grows up and a bit of a buffer is regained, then we can move on to the next area. So we want to make sure that we're not taking it all away at once, and we're allowing some vegetation to grow up, some cover for animals. There's some erosion control, wind blockage before we move on to the next areas. Okay, so here are just a couple examples of the type of work that we're doing here. So at the top, this is work that was done by volunteers. There's quite a bit of garlic mustard there. So we have been working there actually for probably more than 5 years, specifically on the garlic mustard. And you can see what a big difference it can make. Going back this year, so in the top two photos here, going back this year, there was it was about the 5-year mark of working with garlic mustard at the site, and it was amazing to see the reduction really start happening. One thing about invasive species control is, depending on the species, it does take many, many years of continued effort until you really get that result that you're looking for. And garlic mustard is certainly one of those species because it has such a persistent seed bank. So it's been really nice to see that population really start to subside. On the bottom row of photos here, what I'm showing is a population of black locust, which is an invasive tree. And if you're looking at the bottom left-hand photo, you can see that I've kind of drawn the polygon around where the trees were in the wetland. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what it looks like when they're gone. And then this year, so that happened last winter. This year, we have been working on retreating some of the sprouts that have popped up. Black locust is notoriously difficult to control. So we're retreating the sprouts, and also we'll be installing not in just this area, but in the sort of teal area, in the active restoration area, we'll be installing about 1,500 native shrubs and trees to restore the area. So it'll be really exciting, and then I'll have the third photo to show what it looks like afterwards, just in a couple of weeks. Okay, so our second demonstration site is called Windrush Woods. Windrush Woods is quite different from Credit View Wetland. It's completely publicly accessible, and it has a pretty extensive trail system throughout. It also has a BMX trail, which is a bike trail, and there's quite a bit of dumping of yard waste from the neighboring residential houses. So some different challenges at this woodland for sure. It's quite, because there are a lot of trails and because it's heavily used, the soil is quite compacted as well. And there's a lot of movement between different areas of the woodlands. So we've also been working here unofficially for about 5 years because we have been working here with volunteers prior to really starting our invasive species management plan work. We worked with volunteer groups and also with Credit Valley Conservation's Conservation Youth Corp group. So different volunteers basically coming out to help us remove garlic mustard, which is a herbaceous invasive plant that I was talking about, and buckthorn in this woodland. And we've also been doing work with staff here for about 4 years as well. And then in the more recent years, we've been able to hire contractors to get in there and do the work that volunteers and staff weren't able to accomplish. So this site has been a really good opportunity to showcase what volunteers can accomplish if you have a strong community group around the site, or a strong investment from an outside group. So like Credit Valley Conservation's Conservation Youth Corps came here year after year to help us get this done. So this site really represents the power of volunteers, which is really excellent. And it also was really helpful because as we did the work with volunteers and with staff, it really clearly identified the work that we would need to get contractors to do, and ultimately really reduce the cost of the projects. So this site is really exciting. It's nearing completion of all significant work this year, which basically means that we have removed almost all of the priority invasive species out of this woodland, and we'll be moving next year into the monitoring and maintenance phase. So maintaining all of the areas that we've already done control, making sure any of the restoration plantings are surviving, and monitoring for any new species that pop up throughout the woodland. A good example of this is a species called dog strangling vine. So there is a population, dog strangling vine is an invasive herbaceous plant that spreads both by its root fragments, but also by its seeds. You might be able to see on the photo here that there are train tracks along the north end of the site. And unfortunately, there's quite a bit of dog strangling vine there that we don't currently have permission to control because it is on the railway's property and not on our property. So what we see is the seeds blowing into the woodland, and then we go around as staff and dig them up to make sure that it doesn't spread. But really the next step in this project is working with the railroad to get those populations treated so that we don't have to continuously do that monitoring and maintenance for dog strangling vine for eternity. So those are some of the next steps for this project. And here's just a nice photo of before and after. You can see how dense it looks. On the left-hand side, a lot of that is buckthorn, and then on the right, you can see the area. It is a different season as well, but you can see the area cleared out from buckthorn, and similar to Credit View Wetland, there are restoration plantings that will go in there to fill up the space with native trees and shrubs. We always choose trees and shrubs that would typically be found in the ecological community of the natural area to make sure that they grow best and that we're sticking as closely to a natural state as possible. Okay, so I mentioned the big six quite briefly, and I thought that I would take some time to explain what they were. So These invasive plant species were included in our priority list in the Invasive Species Management Plan, but they've actually been pulled out to a higher priority because they're anticipated or known to have the biggest threats to the environment or to human health. And we're calling them our big six because there are six of them, and they're the big bad invasive species that we're trying to deal with. Really, the difference between these species and all of the other species that are on the list is that the other species we are primarily controlling at our invasive species management priority sites, whereas with these species, we will consider controlling them at natural areas across the city. So we'll still be applying the principles for when to control and where to control that are outlined in the Invasive Species Management Plan, but we'll be extending them to some of our other higher quality natural areas across the city rather than restricting them to our priority sites. So what we're working on right now is mapping the populations of these species across the city so that we know where they are and we can best prioritize how to control each of them. I will note, because it's on the screen and many of you might know what it is, we do giant hogweed is a hazardous invasive plant. We actually do have a separate control program for that. So we do control all giant hogweed that we find in the city, no matter where it is, because the risks to human health are so high. So that's a program that is a good example of when there's a good reason to control it, like human health. We can definitely rally the resources to get it all done. So that one is ongoing, but for the other species, we're looking to increase our control across the city. All right. So the ISMP also identified engaging with the public through education volunteer opportunities as a key action to optimize the limited resources that we have and get the invasive species management work done. So that is why I wanted to talk a little bit about our natural area stewardship program. So this slide, or this graph on the slide here, it shows the number of garlic mustard task force volunteers that we've had over the last 6 years. So you can see that it started off really small. There's a little blip in 2020, no one was out working that year. But over the past 2 years, this program has really exploded. And we're really excited to see the level of engagement that we've had from our volunteers. So to explain a little bit about what the Garlic Mustard Task Force is, it's a program that enables anyone in the city to go out and pull garlic mustard in their parks or natural areas, ideally close to their houses. So we've identified a list of parks and natural areas with a good spread across the city that people can go out and do this work. Many of the sites are our ISMP sites. A couple of them aren't, but they're sites that have relatively small populations and volunteers that are really dedicated to doing the work there. So through this program, we provide training to the volunteers, of course, on plant identification, control methods, hazardous plants, ticks, what to do with the bags afterwards, and so on, so that they are fully capable of going out independently and doing the work. So what we have what we've heard from volunteers is that they want to keep working throughout the season. So I didn't mention, but garlic mustard control is really limited to sort of the end of April to the mid-July, depending on the season, just based on when the plant goes to seed. So it goes to seed sometime in July, and then there's no point in pulling it out of the ground anymore because you're just shaking the seeds around. But volunteers really wanted to keep working after that time. And of course, we want to retain volunteers, and keeping volunteers, throughout the year is a good way to do that. So with the success of the program over the last 2 years, this year we decided to expand our garlic mustard task force program into a broader natural area stewardship program and include other program offerings. Some of those offerings include removing invasive ground covers, so things like English ivy, you've probably heard of, periwinkle, winter creeper is a euonymus species, so they can do that throughout the summer months. And we had 22 volunteers sign up to do that this year as well, which is really amazing. And then we also have added an opportunity that we're calling staff-led work days. So those are volunteer opportunities that anyone who signed up for a volunteer program can attend. And it would be going out with forestry staff, so other members of my team that are out doing the work anyways, and then a volunteer can go and help them out with the work that they're doing should they choose to do so. We haven't had as much uptake on that program yet, so we're still really learning to understand if it's an opportunity that people are really interested in, and also what would make that opportunity more attractive to the most enthusiastic volunteers that would want to participate in it. So we're still learning. We're having some program successes and some that aren't taking off as quickly, but we're excited to be able to broaden the scope of our volunteer program. I should also mention that we do run public events in the spring and in the fall, and we've seen pretty good turnout from those as well. But we would like to continue to increase the engagement that we have with Mississauga residents, in particular around our priority sites. So one of the things that we're going to start working on is really trying to build that community or action group around each of the priority sites so that we can have long-lasting stewards of those areas. But these programs are a good starting point. Okay, I think I'm almost through here. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on is our invasive pests and emerging threats. So many of you have probably heard of some of these, and I talked about a couple of them throughout the presentation. So on the top row here, so top left is the emerald ash borer, which I talked about a little bit. Middle top is the LDD or spongy moth, and then on the far right is the Asian longhorn beetle. So these top three species, or these three species that are in the top row, are the species that are listed as priority species in our Invasive Species Management Plan. But the Invasive Species Management Plan also highlights additional pests that we need to be on, the pests and disease, I should say, that we need to be on the lookout for. And those are included in the bottom row of photos here. So on the far left-hand side, we have hemlock woolly adelgid. So those are aphid-like insects, and you can't see them in the photo, but you have a picture of the hemlock and sort of like woolly masses that the hemlock woolly adelgid make and that's how you can actually identify that they're there. In the middle, we have oak wilt, and then on the right-hand side, we have spotted lanternfly. Now, the three on the bottom, I've decided to highlight in this presentation because they are threats that are very close to our borders. So hemlock woolly adelgid has been identified in Hamilton and in Grafton, east of Toronto, as well as in the Niagara region. Oak wilt has recently been identified in several locations across Ontario, and spotted lanternfly has yet to be confirmed to my knowledge in Ontario, but there have been possible sightings, and people are definitely really on the lookout for it. And it's right across the border for sure in the States. So we want to make sure that people are aware of what the emerging threats are and keeping an eye out for them. And that includes members of the public and also like forestry staff at minimum. We also want to increase we're also planning to increase our emerging threats monitoring program. So I mentioned earlier that we have an integrated pest management program for spongy moth. This year, we we extended our monitoring program to hemlock woolly adelgid, and we're looking to continue to expand that to include some of these emerging threats that are really close by, so that we can get so we can identify the populations as soon as possible and act as quickly as possible. And that's part of that early detection, rapid response piece that I was talking about earlier. And the reason that that's so important, I'll just add, is that it allows us to best plan for the more we know about these emerging threats in terms of knowledge. It allows us to plan for the operational requirements and budgets in order to control them. And like I was mentioning, it also allows us to identify them more quickly. Okay, so that was a lot. You might be wondering what's next. So we're going to continue to work at our demonstration sites. We're going to expand the work to the first 5 priority sites. That will be happening in the coming years. You know, the way that the Invasive Species Management Plan has it laid out is 5 years at the 2 demonstration sites, and then you move on to the next 5 sites. But we're going to phase it in. From an operational perspective, it works just a little bit better if we don't start all 5 sites at once. So we're working on plans to phase those sites into our management plans. We are also looking at developing plans for the big 6 species. As I mentioned, we have a good program going for hogweed, and we want to make sure that we're covering the other 5 species as well. We are hoping to continuing to build staff awareness and operational capacity for impending threats, like I was just talking about on the previous slide. And we also want to continue identifying opportunities for knowledge sharing and expanding internal and external partnerships, because those have been really beneficial for us leading up to the creation of the ISMP, and also while implementing the ISMP. And then finally, we want to continue refining our methods and updating the management plan and implementation strategy as necessary, based on what we learn and also what we learn from others. Thank you so much for listening. I will take any questions now. And I can stop sharing here.
Thanks so much, Allie. That was such a great presentation, really great information. We do have a couple questions. I'll start our Q&A session by just popping the actual plan into the chat for everybody to view. I think this will kind of help with our first comment that came in. John was asking if you can share the giant hogweed plans, and they would like to collaborate. So I know that you do mention giant hogweed in the plan itself, so that will hopefully help. And I noted down that email address so you can reach out, Allie. I'll send that for you. Some of the questions that came in here. How long do you allow a particular protocol to be used before it is determined whether it's successful or not?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think this is not going to be the clearest cut answer, but I think the answer is it depends on the protocol. So like I mentioned while I was chatting, the management plan has some really good decision-making tools. It also lays out some, data sheets for baseline monitoring data collection, for control tracking, or tracking the project costs as a whole. And what we've really found is sometimes we identify quite quickly that this process isn't working, and we can alter it. But in some cases, we do want to give it a little bit of a longer time. So with something like the decision-making tool, that helps you decide when to restore a site, that isn't something that we can decide after 6 months of a trial, because we have to wait and see what comes back. We have to wait and see if natural vegetation does restore that area. So for that one, it would be longer term. But really, the idea is that we would trial all of these tools over the first 5 years in our demonstration sites, and then reassess and update them or replace them as needed. So that might be the easiest answer, is to say we have 5 years to do it, but some of them certainly we have we have switched up more quickly.
For sure. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. There are a couple similar questions about volunteering. So what makes a site volunteer friendly? And then how do people find out about these volunteer opportunities? How is it communicated to the public?
Yeah, so those are some really good questions. So what makes a site volunteer friendly is basically if it's safe and if it's accessible. So if it's fenced in and we're asking you to go there by yourself, that's probably not going to be very volunteer friendly. But if we go and we assess the site, basically we look to see if there's any like hangers from trees, so any like hazardous branches, any hazardous plants, any major tripping hazards. Is this a site that collects a lot of beer bottles or garbage? We don't want to send volunteers to sites like that have potential hazards. And we also don't want to send volunteers to sites that have so much of an invasive species that it's overwhelming. So we want to make sure that, especially if we're sending someone there on their own, that it is a manageable and achievable patch of whatever the plant is, because if it is too much, it feels overwhelming, and then it's just like any project, right? It doesn't, if you feel like you have to do it all on your own, and it doesn't seem achievable, then you don't do it. So that is what makes a site volunteer friendly. And depending on the program, there are some other considerations as well, but those are the main ones. In terms of how to find out about volunteer opportunities, you can look up Volunteer Mississauga, and then if you go under Parks, Forestry, and Environment, there is a list of our volunteer opportunities there. There's also a forestry mailing list, which I don't know if it's an option to send out an email to participants after, or maybe we can find it while we're chatting. But there's a forestry email list that you can sign up for Mississauga. And you will also find out about all the opportunities there. You'll also find out about any of our tree planting events, which is like it's our sister program, 1 Million Trees, any public events you can find out through that mailing list. Yeah, those are probably the best ways. Social media, also following on social media will help. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Yeah, we can include those resources and that mailing list in our follow-up email for sure.
Sure. Yeah, I'll make sure I get those to you.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be appreciated. We do have a couple other questions here, but we are out of time. So if you submitted a question and we weren't able to answer it, please feel free to reach out, send it over to us, and we can get you in touch with Allie. So thank you so much again for being here. We really appreciate your time. It was great information, and thank you to all of our attendees for being here as well. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.